Before starting this video, I just want to thank everyone for supporting the previous two videos about Silent Hill. It's really appreciated. I didn't think they would get this much support, so thank you very much for this, and I hope you enjoyed this video too. Silent Hill 4 The Room, a game that dared to break away from the franchise's formula, replacing the fog-covered streets of Silent Hill with a claustrophobic nightmare inside an inescapable apartment. While it divided fans with its experimental mechanics and shift in storytelling, Silent Hill 4 remains one of the most disturbing entries in the series, and this analysis will explore how The Room changed the Silent Hill formula, the significance of its setting, its story depth, and how Henry, despite his quiet nature, fits into this nightmare. When Silent Hill 4 The Room released, it marked a bold shift in the franchise, one that would ultimately divide fans. The game broke away from many of the traditional elements that define Silent Hill, opting for a more experimental approach to storytelling, gameplay mechanics, and even level design. While some saw this as a fresh evolution for the series, others felt it strayed too far from what made Silent Hill iconic. But whether you love it or hate it, there's no denying that Silent Hill 4 was a game that took risks. One of the biggest changes Silent Hill 4 introduced was its structure. Previous games in the series embraced an open world-ish approach, letting players explore the eerie, folk-filled streets of Silent Hill. The town itself was a character, place that shifted and twisted to reflect the protagonist's psyche. Silent Hill 4, however, did away with this entirely. Instead of starting in the town, players were trapped in room 302, a small apartment in South Ashfield Heights. Cut off from the outside world, there were no familiar streets to wander, no radio static guiding the way. The feeling of isolation wasn't just a theme, it was a gameplay mechanic. The apartment acted as both a safe haven and a prison, reinforcing the game's psychological horror. While the room initially seemed like a place of safety, no enemies, no threats, this security was slowly stripped away as supernatural hauntings began manifesting, corrupting what little sanctuary the player had. And then there was the hole in the bathroom, the only way out. Instead of naturally exploring a vast, interconnected world, players were funneled through this tunnel into various otherworldly locations, places tied to the game's antagonist, Walter Sullivan. This change in exploration was a drastic departure from the open-ended nature of the earlier games, and while it added to the claustrophobic horror, it also made Silent Hill 4 feel more linear than its predecessors. Another significant change was the introduction of a first-person perspective while inside Room 302. This was unheard of in Silent Hill at the time. Players had always explored the series' haunted landscape in third person with a camera that emphasized cinematic horror. By forcing the player into a first person while in the apartment, Silent Hill 4 created an intimate and immersive horror experience. Peering through the peephole to watch neighbors go about their lives, pressing an ear against the wall to hear distant conversation, these elements reinforced Henry's isolation. He wasn't just trapped physically but also socially, cut off from the world around him in a disturbing voyeuristic way. This perspective shift also made the haunting in room 302 more terrifying. When ghostly figures started appearing in mirrors or furniture moved on its own, players were forced to experience it all from Henry's viewpoint, making the horror feel inescapable. However, once players left the apartment and entered the other worlds, the game switched back to a third-person perspective. This contrast between perspectives heightened the sense of separation between reality and nightmare, making it clear that even Henry's home wasn't truly safe. While combat had always been a part of Silent Hill, it was never the focus. The series thrived on survival horror, limited resources, unpredictable enemy encounters, and an overall sense of vulnerability. Sorry, I cannot say it. Silent Hill 4, however, leaned harder into combat than previous entries, placing a much greater emphasis on melee weapons. Players had access to an arsenal of blunt objects such as bats, pipes, and golf clubs, each with their own durability. While guns were still available, they were much rarer, making melee combat the primary means of survival. Another major change was the introduction of unkillable ghosts, spectral enemies that could not be permanently defeated without special items. These ghosts would phase through walls, stalk the player endlessly, and even drain health just by being near Henry. This made combat feel more frantic and stressful, as players often had to choose between fighting or fleeing. And the addition of an inventory limit also changed the way players approached resource management. In previous games, players could carry an extensive collection of weapons, healing items, and key objects. In Silent Hill 4, however, Henry could only carry a limited number of items at once, forcing players to make tough decisions about what to bring. This restriction added another layer of tension and strategy that was also a divisive choice among fans. One of the most controversial changes in Silent Hill 4 was its second half, which saw a major shift in gameplay structure. After progressing through several locations tied to Walter Sullivan's ritualistic killings, Henry is tasked with escorting Eileen Galvin, his neighbor, through these areas again. While Eileen is much more durable than most escort characters in horror games, her survival is crucial. If she takes too much damage, she becomes more susceptible to Walter's influence, leading to a worse ending. The decision to revisit previous location also divided players. While it reinforced the idea that Henry was stuck in an inescapable nightmare, some felt that it made the second half of the game feel repetitive. Unlike previous games, which steadily introduced new areas, Silent Hill 4 forced players to traverse the same areas again, but with added threats and obstacles. Silent Hill 4 may have broken the formula, but it did so with purpose. It wasn't trying to be just another Silent Hill game, it was trying to do something different. The removal of open world exploration created a more claustrophobic experience. The first person perspective made the horror feel more personal and immersive. The combat heavy approach and unkillable ghosts forced players into a constant state of tension. The inventory limits added a layer of strategic decision making, and the second half's escort missions emphasized emotional attachment and consequences. For some, these changes made Silent Hill 4 one of the most unique horror games of its time. For others, they strayed too far from what made the series special. But regardless of how players feel about these changes, there's no denying that Silent Hill 4 took risks that made it stand out even today. Henry stands apart from other Silent Hill protagonists in a way that makes him both fascinating and at times frustrating. Compared to James Sunderland's grief-fueled descent into Silent Hill 2 or Heather's Mason deeply personal battle in Silent Hill 3, Henry is almost an enigma. He is quiet, passive, and reacts to the horror around him with minimal emotions. But this seemingly bland characterizations, I cannot say it, sorry, actually serves a greater purpose. It makes Silent Hill 4 feel even more isolating and unsettling. Unlike other Silent Hill protagonists, Henry doesn't have a personal connection to the town's twisted horrors. He is not part of the cult, nor is he drawn to Silent Hill by some deep trauma or guilt. He is simply an ordinary man who unknowingly moves into an apartment that was once home to Walter Sullivan, the game's antagonist. His backstory is vague, deliberately so. We know he isn't a photographer, which is fitting given his observational role in the story. He watches life unfold through his peephole, examines the world around him, but rarely interferes. The game never explores his past or personal struggles, reinforcing the idea that he is not the focus of this nightmare. Walter is. Henry's passivity has been a major criticism of Silent Hill 4, but it is actually one of its strongest narrative choices. He doesn't react with shock or anger when faced with terrifying events, he simply takes them in, much like the player does. This makes him feel more like an audience member than an active participant, emphasizing the game's themes of helplessness and isolation. His limited dialogue and emotionless delivery adds to this effect, where James Sunderland wrestled with his guilt and Heather Mason displayed a full range of emotions. Henry remains distant, detached. His quiet nature forces the player to project their own emotions onto the story. Some may see him as numb from fear, while others may interpret his silence as a reflection of the game's dreamlike, surreal horror. Unlike previous Silent Hill protagonists, Henry has no agency in his fate. He didn't seek out Silent Hill, he didn't come looking for answers. He simply woke up one day and found himself trapped in his apartment. This mirrors the player's own experience. We are thrown into this nightmare without explanation, just like Henry. His minimal interactions with other characters also reinforce his isolation. He doesn't form deep bonds with other victims, and even his relationship with Eileen Galvin, his neighbor, remains distant. While other Silent Hill protagonists had deeply personal motivations, Henry's goal is purely survival. He is not trying to redeem himself or uncover dark secrets. He just wants to escape. Henry might not have personal stakes in Silent Hill 4's horror, but he does play a crucial role in Walter Sullivan's ritual as the final intended sacrifice in the 21 Sacraments. Henry represents the last piece of Walter's twisted puzzle, but unlike the other victims, Henry resists his fate. Despite his passivity, Henry does take actions when it matters. He fights back against Walter's minion, protects Eileen from harm, and ultimately confronts Walter himself. While he may not have the emotional depth of the other protagonists, his presence disturbs Walter's plan, making him a crucial part of the story. Henry is often overlooked in discussions about Silent Hill protagonists, largely because he lacks the personal depth of characters like James or Heather. But his passivity and detached nature serves an important purpose. They reinforce Silent Hill's themes of isolation, helplessness, and being trapped in someone else's nightmare. Would a more expressive protagonist have made this game stronger? Perhaps, but Henry's quiet, almost dreamlike presence makes Silent Hill 4 feel uniquely unsettling. He is not a hero, not a victim with a tragic past, just an ordinary person caught in an extraordinary horror, and in a way that makes him one of the most realistic characters in the series. Henry's silence may make him feel less memorable compared to other Silent Hill protagonists, but his role as an observer trapped in an unfolding nightmare is essential to the game's atmosphere. His story isn't one of redemption or self-discovery. It's about survival, disconnection, and being at the mercy of forces beyond his control. One of the most striking aspects of Silent Hill 4: The Room is its cast of side characters. Unlike previous games where secondary characters often had deep psychological connection to the protagonist, Silent Hill 4's supporting cast is instead tied to Walter Sullivan's ritualistic murders. Each character plays a role in his grand plan, making them feel like pieces of puzzle rather than accidental figures in Henry's nightmare. What makes them compelling is that they feel real, just normal people living their lives in South Ashfield Heights, unaware that they're caught in a death cycle orchestrated by a disturbed killer. Each of them has their own struggles, desires, and backstories, but fate has already decided their end. Eileen is arguably the most important side character in Silent Hill 4. She's Henry's neighbor in room 303, and unlike many of the others, she isn't outright hostile or mysterious. She's just an ordinary woman caught up in an extraordinary horror. What makes Eileen unique is that she's the only victim in Walter's ritual that isn't killed immediately. As the intended 20th sacrament, she is severely wounded but left alive, giving Henry a chance to save her. This also makes her the centerpiece of the game's second half, where Henry has to escort her through the other world while avoiding her descent into Walter's influence. Eileen is also a rare example of an escort character done right. She can take care of herself, attacking enemies when needed, and she doesn't have a health bar in traditional sense. Instead, the more damage she takes, the more she succumbs to Walter's control. If she falls too far under his influence, she will walk willingly into her own death, leading to one of the game's bad ending. Despite her tragic circumstances, Eileen never truly loses her kindness. She's one of the few people in the game who treats Henry like an actual person rather than an intruder or nuisance. Her survival depends on the player's actions, making her one of the most emotionally impactful characters of Silent Hill 4.
Yeah.
Frank Sunderland is Henry's landlord, and though he doesn't have a major role in the story, his connection to the Silent Hill universe is a huge detail. He's the father of James Sunderland, the protagonist of Silent Hill 2. Frank is a quiet and unassuming old man, mostly seen through Henry's peephole as he mops the hallway. However, his small role is laced with sadness. He keeps a box of old things belonging to his son, hinting that James never returned home after the events of Silent Hill 2. While it's never explicitly stated, this implies that James either disappeared or died, leaving his father in quiet grief. Frank is also the only character who expresses genuine concern for Henry, leaving notes under his door when he doesn't respond. Unlike the others, who are either victims or aggressors, Frank simply exists on the edge of the horror, unaware how deeply the nightmare is consuming room 302.
The guy who lives here, what's he like anyway?
Richard Braintree, the resident of room 207, is one of the more aggressive characters in Silent Hill 4. He's loud, abrasive, and seems to have a violent past, making him one of the least sympathetic victims in Walter's ritual. However, Richard's fate is one of the most disturbing in the game. He is electrocuted to death in the other world, left twitching and fried in one of Walter's grisly murders. Even worse, his ghost becomes one of the most dangerous enemies Henry encounters. He can teleport, summon lightning, and attack relentlessly, making him a constant threat throughout the game. Despite his hostility, Richard's character hints at a deeper story. There are suggestions that he might have been abusive or involved in a criminal activity, which is why Walter saw him as an ideal sacrifice. But whether he deserved his fate or not, his transformation into a vengeful ghost ensures that he never truly escaped the nightmare.
This is my dream, and you don't even know my name.
Cynthia, a resident of South Ashfield Heights, is introduced as a flirtatious and confident woman who initially believes she's trapped in a dream. When she meets Henry, she doesn't take things seriously at first, even flirting with him while asking for help. But her fate is far from lighthearted. As Walter's 16th sacrament, Cynthia is brutally stabbed to death in the subway station. Her belief that she was in a dream makes her death even more tragic. She never realized the danger she was in until it was too late. Her ghost is one of the most terrifying in the game, moving at an unnaturally fast speed and whispering eerily as she haunts Henry. Unlike Richard, who lashes out in a rage, Cynthia's ghost seems to be locked in an eternal state of confusion and pain, making her one of the saddest casualties in Walter's ritual.
And now those guys are using it too.
Jasper is one of the more eccentric side characters, a man obsessed with supernatural and Silent Hill's dark past. He's awkward, speaks in a weird, stammering way, and knows far more about Walter Sullivan than he should. Unfortunately for him, knowledge isn't power in this story. As Walter's 17th sacrament, Jasper is buried alive in the forest, a horrifying contrast to his timid and anxious personality. His ghost remains trapped in the other world, repeating phrases about how he's burning up, a reminder of his gruesome fate. Jasper's role in the story is relatively small, but he represents a common theme in Silent Hill: curiosity leading to doom. Like many before him, he wanted to uncover the town's secret, but in doing so, he got too close to something he never should have.
Make me stay in there, Walt. Walter, I'm telling you, stay down.
Andrew is a former prison guard who worked at the Walter prison, a location tied to Walter Sullivan's past. He isn't a kind man. He was known for mistreating prisoners and was likely involved in the abuse that occurred there. As Walter's 18th sacrament, Andrew is drowned in a bloody pool of water, a grim irony given his past crimes. Unlike other ghosts, his spirit doesn't attack Henry as aggressively, instead remaining moaning and disoriented, as if trapped in an endless cycle of suffering. Andrew's character reflects one of Silent Hill's major themes, the weight of past sins. Even though he wasn't directly connected to Walter as a child, his cruelty made him a fitting sacrifice in Walter's twisted ritual. While Walter is technically the antagonist, he was once just another child who lived in room 302, abandoned and left to be shaped by the horrors around him. His twisted belief that he needed to perform the 21 sacraments to bring his mother, room 302, back to life led to all of the game's tragic events. Each side character, whether innocent or guilty, became a piece of his dark ritual, their lives stalling to fuel his obsession. Unlike previous Silent Hill games where side characters had deep personal ties to the protagonist, Silent Hill 4 cast exists in a more detached yet tragic way. They are victims, people caught up in something beyond their understanding. Some deserved it, some didn't, but all of them were powerless against Walter's plan. This makes the game's horror even more unsettling. These weren't lost souls drawn to Silent Hill, they were just normal people living their lives until fate decided otherwise. Room 302 is more than just a setting in Silent Hill for the room. It is the very foundation of the game's horror. Unlike previous entries where Silent Hill itself served as the primary location of psychological torment, this game shifts the horror to an apartment. The room is not just a place where the story begins, it is an evolving entity that reflects both Henry's isolation and Walter Sullivan's obsession. At first, Room 302 feels like a safe haven. When Henry wakes up, locked inside with no way out, the apartment serves as a base where the player can breathe, heal, and observe the world outside. The room is silent, offering no explanation for why Henry is trapped. The first person perspective inside the apartment makes the experience feel voyeuristic, intensifying the sense of helplessness. But as the game progresses, the room changes. It stops being a place of safety. The walls begin to rot, objects move on their own, and grotesque hauntings manifest, attacking Henry directly. The only way to keep the hauntings at bay is by using special candles, but even then, the feeling of safety is permanently shattered. The room, once a shelter, becomes a suffocating nightmare. Thematically, Room 302 represents Henry is physically cut off from the world. He can hear life going on outside but cannot participate. He can look through the peephole at his neighbor Eileen, but he cannot warn or interact with her. He is a passive observer, mirroring the player's feeling of helplessness. The game forces Henry and the player to keep returning to the room. Despite the horrors creeping into it, it becomes a prison, reinforcing themes of being trapped in cycles of trauma, much like Walter Sullivan, who remains emotionally bound to the apartment even in death. To Walter, Room 302 was his mother. Having grown up an orphan, he was manipulated into believing that completing the 21 sacraments would reunite him with her. The apartment then is both his birthplace and his ultimate goal, making it the perfect setting for his ritual. Room 302 is not just a backdrop, it is alive. The way it shifts throughout the game mirrors the horror of the world around Henry. At first, the only noticeable issue is that the door is chained shut. Over time, cracks form in the walls, mysterious messages appears, and the apartment becomes more twisted and unnatural. By the time it's fully haunted, it feels almost like a sentient being, punishing Henry for overstaying his welcome. It's rare for a survival horror game to make a single location this impactful. Whereas other Silent Hill titles let players explore large, open areas, Silent Hill 4 forces them to endure the slow, suffocating transformation of a small, confined space. This shift makes the horror feel deeply personal. There is no vast town to escape to, only four walls that are closing in. Room 302 changed how Silent Hill approaches horror. It proved that fear doesn't have to come from a sprawling, foggy town. True horror can come from being trapped in a single place, watching it decay, feeling it turn against you, knowing there's no escape. Would Silent Hill 4 have worked as well without the apartment setting? Absolutely no. The game's horror thrives on the contrast between perceived safety and inescapable terror. Room 302 isn't just where the game starts, it is the very heart of the horror.
Oh man. What a dream.
Silent Hill 4 The Room may have been a controversial departure from the franchise formula, but it remains one of the most unique horror experiences in gaming. Its changes to exploration, its hauntingly oppressive atmosphere, and its deeply unsettling story make it a standout entry in the series. Though it may not have reached the same legendary status as Silent Hill 2 or Silent Hill 3, its influence can still be felt in modern horror games that experiment with confined spaces, first-person perspectives, and psychological horror. Whether you love it or hate it, there's no denying that Silent Hill 4 left a lasting mark on the survival horror genre. So, what do you think? Was Silent Hill 4 an underrated masterpiece or a flawed experiment? Let me know in the comments, and if you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to like and subscribe for more horror game analysis.